What's going on, everybody? I'm Jay, the Reformed Puerto Rican dude. Thank you so much for watching this video. Today, I am joined by the white, non-face slapping Will Smith. Will is a deacon at Providence Bible Church in Beckley, West Virginia. He's been a missionary in several places, including South Africa, and my very own Puerto Rico. And he is also a fellow admin in Wastiwak, depending on how you pronounce it. How's it going, Will?
Good. How are you doing, Jay?
Pretty good, pretty good. So everybody listening in, listen, Will is joining us today to talk about reaching the younger generation, evangelism, and missions work. But before we do all that, I know Will, right? Just because I've worked with him already, but you guys don't. And Will, I don't know if you've been watching some of my interviews, but I typically like to ask people that join me, about their testimony briefly, and kind of like where you ended up now. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. I was raised in a very godly Christian home, in church every time the doors were open, as they say. I made a profession of faith at the age of 6 and was baptized at the age of 7. Had rocky years in the teens a little bit, but when I was 15, we went to South Africa as missionaries. So that was definitely a life-changing experience for me, and was there for a few years, came back home, finished high school, went a couple years to college, and then went back to South Africa as a missionary youth pastor myself. Went to Puerto Rico, met my wife. We had 2 children there, and decided after 5 years in Puerto Rico that it was time to come back home, and came back to West Virginia. Been working in the ATV, power sports, side-by-sides, personal watercraft industry for the last 21 years. Manage a dealership here in Beckley. And like I say, I'm a deacon at our church and have 6 children. So that's my number one responsibility, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and what do you do now as a deacon? What are some of your primary responsibilities?
Well, I mean, the deacons, we believe, are there to oversee the physical needs of the church. So, I mean, I'm the guy with the checkbook. I pay all the bills. I count all the money. I make the deposits. But beyond that, I mean, there are 2 other deacons, and we share those responsibilities as far as, putting in a new water tank or seeing that the grass gets mowed, and just anything that has to do with the material, physical needs of the congregation. I mean, I'm obviously participate in the spiritual things as well. I get opportunity to lead the Lord's table as each man in fellowship in our church gets to participate in that. And then occasionally get to have a Sunday morning message too. So, and teach the teenagers some too. So
cool. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to talk to you a bit about the teenagers. So, I know that you do it. I think we've talked about it before. Is it like Wednesday nights or Thursday nights or something like that, correct?
Yeah, typically what we do is Wednesday night during our midweek meeting, we've been doing Look at the Book with John Piper, and we kind of watch it all together. And then the teens go back into the fellowship hall and kind of have our own discussion about the lesson that we just watched, the verses, passage, heck, with John Piper, sometimes it's just one word that he's talking about for 30 minutes. But yeah, we just go and have our own discussion with the teens, and we've done different things. We haven't always done Look at the Book. We've done different programs. We've just done different studies, and then we also do right now we're doing a monthly activity, usually on a Friday night. Maybe going to someone from the church's house, maybe meeting at the church building for games. But it's just a fun social time for our teenagers, basically.
Cool. So, since we're going to be on the topic, well, kind of hitting several topics today, but one of the topics is reaching the youth and the younger generation, Gen Z. Obviously, I think a lot of people would agree that we as a church collectively, right, universally, are having a bit of a problem with reaching the younger generation. But, I kind of wanted to ask you, what first led you to youth ministry?
Well, two men really. When I was in South Africa as a teenager with my folks as missionaries, we had a youth pastor, and really, I don't think he would have approved the term youth pastor, but he was our youth leader, we'll say, um, by the name of Rowan Krebs, a guy that just had a tremendous impact on me. His passion and his just being a fun guy and being around him, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be like Rowan was. And Ken Hare was another one. My older brother was working on the youth staff at the church they were part of at the time, at Daniel's Bible Church. And Ken Hare was the youth pastor, and he was another guy that just kind of pointed me in that direction, just more spiritually, but just a great guy. And that's what I wanted to do, was to be a youth pastor. And of course, I did end up being a youth pastor. And then I think somewhere along the road, I realized that I didn't feel that youth pastor was really a biblical position. And I can talk a little bit about those times and that transition for me. But I think I'll just say this. I think when you start to usurp the role of the father in the family, so when that 15-year-old boy is coming to you with his questions, and that 13-year-old girl is going to my wife with those questions that they should be talking to their own parents about, I think that's when I realize that there are a lot of teenagers that don't have parents that they can talk to about those things, whether they're spiritually immature, maybe not believers, maybe they're not alive. I mean, I think there's a place for that position, for that person in the life of those teenagers. But I just think fathers need to lead their families. Amen. And I think sometimes we just push that responsibility off on the youth pastor or the youth leader. And I don't think that's healthy for our churches. So that's how I got into being a youth pastor, and kind of how I got out of being a youth pastor.
Yeah, it's funny. I just shared a meme. Well, not really a meme, like statistics, really. And I don't recall off the top of my head what the source was, but it basically said something along the lines of like, if you have both parents attending church, there's like an 80% chance that the children will remain in the faith. If you have just the mom, or I'm sorry, just the dad going to the church, it's 55% chance that the kids will remain faithful. And then if it's only the mom attending church, it was something like, I don't remember, it was like 10%
17.
or 17%. It
I
was
think it was
real low.
17 or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, obviously, when it was neither parents, like 6%. So it's really low. But the point is that uh, the father seems to have a much more significant role in children ultimately remaining in the faith. So I would say that that's definitely a big issue with the generation today, and I feel like each generation seems to be getting worse. Um, and maybe you can comment on that, but I do want to ask you specifically, beyond that, what do you think is severely lacking when it comes to this new generation, and just not embracing the faith? What do you think is going on there?
Well, honestly, candidly, I think that I wouldn't say that this generation is severely lacking. I just think that it's more obvious. In other words, I think when it comes to our generation, or our parents' generation, or our grandparents' generation, I think there was just a cultural respect for faith, for spirituality, even if it was misguided or misplaced. But so culturally, the average boy, the average girl in school looked more like a believer than they do today. So I think that contrast is greater and different. But I think God is still sovereign. I think God will save all that He will save.
Amen.
And I don't think if you broke that into a ratio, that it's less than it was 50 years ago. I just think it's more obvious. I think technology, the video games, all these things right at the tips of our fingers. Anything that we want to know, anything that we want to see, pretty much we can get to it lickety split, and it's all right there. And the communication. I mean, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids walking around with these little magic boxes that they can contact their friends any time of the day. I mean, I just think those things tend to accentuate the underlying problem, which is and always will be the heart of man. I mean, I think that's our hearts are the problem. And I just think culturally, it's far more acceptable to have different color hairs and wear different kind of clothes. And, I just think that it's easier to identify, a kid that's a genuine believer than it was 50 years ago. So I don't know that those ratios are really that different. And maybe they are. And I do think that there are, I looked at that meme that you were talking about today. I mean, the father's role in the life of their children is immense.
Absolutely.
And, but I think there is a problem there, but I just don't think it's a new problem. I think that cultural Christianity that deceives people or deceived people 50 years ago is just not as common as it was.
Would you say, because I'm thinking about this, right? And
Mhm.
I'm thinking, well, I think that there's something to be said about the fact that the gospel was probably proclaimed by a lot more people in terms of volume,
Mhm.
um, maybe 50 years ago than it is today. And so I would imagine, I mean, God works through means, right? That's
Mhm.
actually, I don't mean to hijack this conversation
Yep.
because I'm supposed to be asking you questions, but I kind of want to set up a premise here and
Mhm.
see what you think about it. So in that thing that I shared today, somebody said something along the lines of, okay, so God doesn't choose, right? It just depends on whether the father plays an active role or not. And I responded to that person. I said, no, God still chooses, but what we do matters, right? Like God doesn't elect arbitrarily, right? Like God elects, or I'm sorry, God works through means, right?
Mhm.
So for example, um, 50 years ago, maybe, and again, you can kind of push back on this. I don't mind.
Mhm.
50 years ago, maybe God had a lot more elect people than uh, today's time because he put them in homes where the father would preach the gospel often, would talk about God more often than nowadays, right? And so God works through those means, and by us being faithful, God, through the power of the Holy Spirit specifically, opens hearts so that as we as fathers, right, we preach the gospel to our children every day,
Mhm.
he will regenerate ordinarily those children of faithful parents. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I don't have empirical data on that, and I
Sure.
don't know that anybody does really.
Right.
Like, what percentage of our youth were actual bona fide believers 50 years ago versus today? I think my knee jerk is to say that it's not that different a ratio. I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
God is doing what He's doing, and I just think it's that it was easier to hide in full view 50 years ago because everybody said yes
Right.
sir and no sir, and so I don't know, but yeah, I definitely think there is, I mean, God works through families. I mean, that's
Hmm.
the primary means by which the gospel is spread is through families.
Right.
So when you have a father that's not there, um, that does require a different means than through
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
father.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show the value of biblical principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because um, the Bible proves to be true again and again and again. And whenever, excuse me, we get out of that, we see the consequences pretty quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so when you say that it's more obvious, do you believe that and I'm trying to think of how I'm going to word this correctly, but do you believe that there was a sense of respect for biblical principles maybe 50 years ago, than there is now? Or would you say it was about the same, but now it's just, the fruit are showing? I guess the bad fruit are showing. Would you say
Yeah,
something along those lines?
I would say that there's a tremendous difference in cultural respect for Christianity. I hear my dad said it 100 times. When he was a boy, a man used to get off his horse and lead it past the church building on Sunday mornings when a church meeting was going on. Somebody that didn't care to be in church meeting, couldn't be bothered, but had enough respect for those that did to dismount off of his horse and walk it past the church building so you didn't hear while you're in church meeting on Sunday morning. So I just think those cultural things have just changed. It's like a post-Christian society. And let me say one other thing too about that last topic. I was kind of saving it for a little bit, but we need to be careful, Christian parents who raise godly children, of patting ourselves on the back.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Well, I'm assuming that you're saying that we have to understand that whatever good happens with our children, despite what we have done, it's ultimately God's work. I'm assuming that's where you're going with this.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. What we have is by grace. And it's not just because Johnny over there is away from the Lord, his parents don't mean that his parents were failures.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Don't just because Billy over here is a really good boy doesn't mean that his parents were perfect. So I think we tend to I know with my own parents, I heard for so many years how great they were because, all 5 of their children were, living godly, respectable lives, that they pushed all the right buttons at all the right times and they did such a good job. But no, that's grace. That's what that is grace. And so, we are called to train up our children. We are called to discipline our children. We are called to instruct them in the ways of the Lord. But I just think we need to be careful about the results because that's God's territory and not so much ours.
Right. Yeah. It makes me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with John Piper's son, Abraham Piper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, he's a very outspoken atheist and this and that. And, John Piper's not perfect. No man is. But, you look at his other children, and I'm not judging, obviously, but, we can only see from the outside looking in, especially him being such a notable figure. Right. And I see, I've heard people, even pastors online, give all kinds of opinions, and I hesitate to make any conclusions about it because just as much as you may look at Abraham Piper and see what he's doing, and maybe that speaks about how John Piper was as a father, but then again, I look at his other children; they're not away from the faith, right? So I agree with you. I think that we have to understand that ordinarily, yes, we should expect our children to be believers. We should raise them as believers. But at the same time, we need to understand that, like you're saying, it is by God's grace. Absolutely, 100%. It is not us, right? God works through us, but he's going to save who he's going to save. So, and you and I are both Calvinists, so of course we're going to agree on that. So if somebody's watching, maybe they disagree a little bit because they're not Calvinists. So anyway,
and that doesn't relieve us of our responsibility.
Absolutely.
Like that. I'm not trying to say that at all. We need to do these things. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about these things here in just a minute, but there are things that we need to do, but there's no guaranteed success ratio because that is the purview of God.
Definitely. 100%. Absolutely. And, without getting into the Calvinism thing too much, right? That's some of the arguments that sometimes you hear against Calvinism. Well, we don't have responsibility. No, man has a volition, man has a will, right? Like man is held responsible for what he does or doesn't do. That's not, what Calvinism is saying at all. So, So yeah, absolutely. 100%. We as parents are expected to raise up our children in the way of the Lord, which leads me to my next question. I think that we as Christians, right? Particularly Christian parents, we can overlook the the part about God being the one that actually works through us and what we do, that maybe we push our children too far,
Hmm.
right? And so, how would you say that Christian parents should share our faith
Hmm.
with our children without pushing them away, right? What are your thoughts on, for example, like catechizing your kids,
Hmm.
or doing family worship, those kinds of things?
Yeah, let me tell you the most important thing you can do as a father for your children is to love your wife, is to
Mm,
love their mother, is to lay down your life for her, to be faithful to her. And if you're a mom watching, your most important thing that you can do for your children is to submit yourself to their father. Be respectful to their father. Because all of those pre-programmed, pre-planned things that we're going to talk about here in a minute, they don't matter if you don't live what you believe.
yep, absolutely.
So the second thing that we can do for our children is to be a part of a local church. And by be a part of a local church, I mean be a participant in a local church. Not what church do you go to, what church are you a part of?
Hmm.
You know, we all have a part to play. Like if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12, I mean, somebody's a foot, somebody's a hand, somebody's an eye. You know, we all have a different role, and yours may be taking out the trash. Take out the trash to the glory of God in
Amen.
your local assembly.
Amen.
That is essential. There's no obedient Christianity separate from the local body. So love your spouse. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, submit to your husbands. Be part of a local church. That's where it starts. That's where it starts. And then, yes, beyond that, catechisms are great. I mean, we did a lot of different things with our kids. And like I say, most of ours are pretty well grown at this point. But, we have done Advent readings where we sit down every night of the week and read a story, discuss things. We've sang songs together. We've done catechisms together. And I think that's so important is uh, our children see the liturgy of our lives, right?
Mm.
So
Amen.
they see what we do. My dad always says, "What you say you do is not what you do. What you do is what you do."
Yep.
So my kids know, as you well know, I love West Virginia. I love Liverpool. Actually, I'm wearing my Liverpool shirt today because we beat Manchester United 7-0 on Sunday, and that's like the greatest victory in the history of the Premier League, pretty much there. But they know I love West Virginia. They know I love Liverpool. They know I love pizza without pineapple because we all know that's heresy.
Don't start.
But listen, if my kids don't know that I love God and I love His Word, then what else matters? That's a pretty sad commentary on me as a parent. They
Yep.
know I love all these things, but they don't know that I love God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean,
Absolutely.
I say all that to say that's how you do it without pushing them away. I think we push our children away when we tell them one thing and then we do something else. I
Mhm.
think that's what causes the hypocrisy. And we're all hypocrites. Don't get me wrong, because none of us are perfect. But when it's that day after day, like do as I say, not as I do mentality, I think that's what drives our children away.
Yeah.
So, yeah, ask them to study, ask them to memorize scriptures, ask them to memorize catechisms. You drill those things into their noggins when they're young so they can remember it. But be doers of the word. Don't just be hearers. Don't just give lip service. Don't just tell them what to do and then do something completely different.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. One of the things that I do with my children, and I'm not saying this to brag at all. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
this is something I wish I didn't have to do. Um, and not that it happens often, but whenever I make a mistake, one of the things that I do is that I tell my children, "Daddy was wrong."
Mm-hmm.
you know and I think that people can't be afraid, because children, when they're young, they kind of see. I remember, when I was a kid, I looked up to my my mom and dad, and they could do no wrong. And as you grow older, you start realizing like, oh wow, wait a minute, like they're not perfect.
Yeah.
They are fallible,
Right.
and that kind of that shocks you a little bit as a
Hmm.
kid. I, 35 years old now, but I remember being like, 10, 11, 12 years old and kind of noticing that in my parents just a little bit. And I try to show my children, uh, no, when I say we're all sinners, I'm not kidding. Like, you know, I am a sinner, and sometimes I will say, Daddy's sorry for what he did. Um, and he shouldn't do it. And then not only do I not only do I apologize, right? And I say like I shouldn't have done what I do, but then I tell them now I'm going to make every effort not to do that again. And I actually try to show them that I'm making an effort not to do that again, right? Because they follow that lead. And it's like you're saying, they'll notice if you're a hypocrite, right?
Yeah.
If you do it over and over again, they're not going to take it serious.
Yeah. You're living the life. You're putting the faith. You're putting feet to the faith.
And it's not easy.
It's not.
It's not easy because it takes a lot of putting down your pride, a lot of, just being willing to. And they're young. My oldest is 6, right? But
Mhm.
I want them to see these things, the earlier the better, right? Because that I think that that's one of the ways that children can mature in knowing the truths about the scriptures. And so that's what I want for them ultimately.
Yep.
Okay. So, um I want to go ahead and well, actually, before I do that, um we've been talking about, how families can raise up their children without pushing them away. But I don't want to just bash on the church too much right now.
Hmm.
But I know that the church could always do better. And so, um, what do you think that churches could do a little bit better nowadays to equip their congregation to train up their own children? Right? You mentioned a
Hmm.
little bit about how sometimes parents overly depend on the church to kind of train up their children instead of stepping up.
Right.
But how can the church train up these parents to then go ahead and train up their own children?
I mean, this is one of those things that I think is really simple. And again, we don't want to confuse simple with easy,
Yep.
but it's simple. Teach the word. That's the key. Are your children singing with you? Are your children hearing the word with you? Somehow we've got this concept, and it not in our circle so much, Jay, but what the evangelize circles where we think more fog machines and we think more laser shows and more bigger, better vacation Bible schools or whatever it may be.
Hmm.
That is not where the power is. The power is in the word. And are we rubbing shoulders with our teens, with our young people? Are we saying, hey, John, hey, why don't you come over and help me carry this table? Hey, you three, come with me. I've got a job for you. Are we including them in that ministry? When I was a youth pastor in Puerto Rico, we had our Grace Bible Church Youth Department T-shirts, and on the back we had our slogan, which is not the church of tomorrow, the church of today. Because I think we always think about teens and the children as the church of tomorrow, but we fail to understand that they're part of the church today.
Yep.
And so I think from each individual person in the congregation, are we rubbing shoulders with these teens? Are we just having conversations with them? Are we asking them about their schoolwork, about what they're struggling with? Are we asking if we can pray with them about something? Any of those kinds of things. I mean, those are the things. They're the simple things.
Yep.
It's not
Yep.
the fog machine. It's not the grand display. It's the daily doing the little things that we're supposed to do. That's
Yep.
what I think the key is to engaging our teenagers and making them participatory in the ministry that we have.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know if you've heard of Vodi Bakum speaking on how he feels about like teen groups and things like
Mhm.
that. I don't know. Have you heard any of it?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so he's very, very much against uh, church groups where you break people up into age.
Yeah.
He's very, very adamantly against it. And I wouldn't say I go as far as saying we should never have teen groups, we should never have, college and career or young adults groups or anything like that. But I think that there is something to be said about the argument that he uses, right? He
Mhm.
says, you know, um, nowhere in the Bible do you see uh, people being broken up in the church by age, right? Now, I'm not gonna sit here and say that, like, just because the Bible doesn't say it doesn't explicitly mean that we can't do it. But I do believe that the Bible seems to indicate, and this is, I think, what you're alluding to.
Mhm.
Um, the Bible does say that we need to be one body together, regardless of age,
Mhm.
right? And part of the responsibility of older Christians is to disciple younger Christians. So I definitely think that we have to be careful not to overly depend on youth groups and things like that. For example, in my church, at a lot of churches nowadays on Sundays, you have teens going to the teen group instead of going and listening to a
Right.
sermon. You have the preschool kids with the preschool kids. And so we wonder, right, by the time that they're done, why don't they understand and know the things that are going on in church that we do, right? Because
Right.
we're not congregating together
We're on different
as a
levels all the time.
correct, correct. And I do agree that that's not the biblical model,
Yeah.
right? So I definitely think that there's a problem there. And I'm sorry, I'm not again. Every time you say something, you make me think of something else that I want to
Mhm.
say.
That's fine.
Um, but um, but yeah, I definitely think that that's a problem in the church today as well. Would you say that?
Yeah.
You know,
Here's how I would address that. I think the Sunday morning meeting of the church is the biblically prescribed meeting. So Wednesday night, great, it's good, it's profitable, it's beneficial. It's not biblically prescribed that we have a meeting on Wednesday night. So I think when it comes time for that Sunday morning meeting, I think families should be together.
amen.
I think crying babies. I don't want to speak for my church in totem, but our my opinion, and I think our general operation is we want babies in the auditorium. If they're screaming and crying, I mean, hey, there's some point when maybe you do everybody a favor and walk out to the back or something and deal with something. But children in our auditorium is not a bad thing.
Hmm.
Children in our auditorium is a good thing. We love that thing. Matter of fact, one of my personal ministries is, I like to call myself the baby whisperer. So I like to go to find whichever baby needs some attention and let mom and dad sit and listen to a sermon and maybe take that baby and go to the back of the room and just kind of rock them or play a game with them or whatever. I've been doing that since my kids got old enough to sit by themselves. I've been trying to help young mothers and fathers in that respect, but I love it. I love to get those babies and get a chance to spend some time with them. But yeah, I think that the point is we all need to be there. We call that family integrated corporate worship,
Yes.
and I think it's extremely important. So I think not to disagree with what Vadi's saying, and maybe we're not, but I think Wednesday night you have a little bit more license. If you do something on a Friday evening with the teenagers, I think you have license to do that. I don't think you can never do those things, but I do kind of feel pretty strongly that Sunday morning is not the time to segregate your families.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Absolutely. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and shift gears here a little bit.
Okay.
One of the things that we wanted to talk about was missions work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like we've already mentioned, you've been a missionary at a couple of places. So, maybe somebody's listening and they're interested in missions work,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't really, they don't know the first thing about it. Maybe their church hasn't spoken much about missions work. So,
Mm-hmm.
how does someone look to become a missionary, and how do they go about becoming a missionary?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to point out about this topic or about this idea is I may get some pushback on this, and maybe you might want to push back on me on this, but I feel like we put an awful lot of emphasis on a calling.
Okay.
So whether that be to foreign missions as a full-time missionary, as a pastor, as an elder, we almost make it some mystical call. Like, you'll hear people say, yeah, God called me to preach, but I ran from him for 20 years, but he finally caught me, or something like that. And I don't know really where we get that concept, because when you look at the word calling in the scripture, we're all called. I mean, I actually looked today because I was thinking about this topic, and I'm looking through lists of verses with the word calling in it, and it's consistent that it's not like some are called to be a pastor, some are called to be a missionary. We are all called. We all should live worthy of our calling. Those whom he called, it's all of us. So I think we kind of put this mystical, if you don't have this mystical calling on your life, then you can't be a missionary or even a pastor or some other full-time ministry position, because God calls those people. It's a special call other than the call that you get to repentance and to believe. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be my first exhortation to you, if you're watching and you're interested in missions, is go be a missionary. Now, listen, to be an elder, you got to meet certain requirements, right? Mm-hmm. And I think to be an exported foreign missionary, you need to meet those same requirements. Okay. Now, I'm not saying there's not a place in missions for single women or independent women, widowed women, whatever it may be. There is. So I'm not saying you have to be a man like you would to be a pastor, so to speak. But there's a mission out there. If you feel like you want to do that, that's your call, folks. It's not like some lightning bolt moment where you get, this sudden realization, I'm being called to be a missionary. Just, if you want to go. Mm-hmm. We're all given the Great Commission. That's what our life is for. I mean, that's what our work here is for, is to make disciples. And whether that's in our local congregation or in Africa or Asia or Europe, just go do it. So I think that would be my first exhortation about that. So there's lots of things that get called missions today, and I think that would be one thing that would be helpful to clarify, is what are we talking about when we say missions?
Yep.
So I'm all for digging wells for people in India that need water, but I don't think that that's necessarily missions. So running an orphanage is a great thing, but that's not necessarily biblical missions. That can be part of it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not denigrating. I'm not. I think those things are tremendously valuable things. And one thing I would like to do maybe in the future is have a sports ministry where you take a soccer team and go play soccer games someplace and and have a ministry doing that. I'm not against those things. I'm for that. I want to participate in those things too. But I think it's important that we understand that building churches is what real missions is. Mm-hmm. And all those things can support that and can be part of that. But the mission is building churches. It's making disciples and organizing them into churches. Yep. So I think that's the thing we have to understand first. And we can be involved in all these different support missions if we want. And there are lots of good mission agencies. But ideally, that process starts with your local church. If you want to be a missionary, go talk to your elders. That's where that needs to start. They can encourage you. They can say, hey, you need to work on this, or hey, we don't think you're ready to do that, or hey, let's make this happen. Here, how can we do this? I don't think it's appropriate to come to the elders and say, hey, I've decided to be a missionary and I'm going with this mission board and we're going to go do this and I'm going to be in Suriname. That's not the way that works. That's putting that cart before that horse. You need to go through your local body, your local leadership first. That's where that needs to start.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't give you pushback on what you said earlier about us thinking about like, oh, it's like this magical calling that we have to hear, the voice of God telling us, you need to go do X, Y, or Z. No, I mean, God will put desires in your heart.
Absolutely.
We we don't deny that the Holy
Hmm.
Spirit is working in the heart. Um, I think we just have to do it biblically, right? And so you do need, I mean, you already mentioned this, but you do need to meet certain qualifications. Um, Burke Parsons, I don't know if you know Burke Parsons. He's the pastor over in St. Andrews. I think it's in Orlando, right? Or
Okay.
near Orlando. He's the pastor for R.C. Sproul's church, right? The
Okay.
one that he used to pastor at. And Burke Parsons said something that I thought that was very wise, right? After
Hmm.
establishing obviously the need that, like, hey, you first need to meet the biblical requirements for a pastor. You need to be a man, you need to be the husband of one wife, etc. You need to be able to teach above reproach.
Hmm.
But one other thing that he said is to understand that the calling is a hard calling, right? Like, if we're gonna call it a calling,
Hmm.
it's not an easy job, right? It's a hard job. It's one of the hardest things that a human being will be called to do,
Hmm.
and so we have to count the cost. Number one, and he said the other thing is do it only if you can't imagine yourself doing anything else.
Mm.
Because way too many people, he said, way too many people become pastors who probably shouldn't be pastors.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think that with pastors, especially, we have to approach it that way. But whatever we do, we have to think about it like that. We have to
Hmm.
count the cost before we move forward and understand that we're called to carry our cross and follow Christ. And no matter what we do in our service to him, there are going to be challenges. It's not just going to be, I think a lot of younger people that think about missions work and that kind of thing probably think, oh, cool, I'm going to go to wherever and take pictures with the locals. And, they kind of think of it as a vacation, so to speak.
Hmm.
And I get to preach the gospel while I'm at it. So that sounds
Hmm.
good too. But it's not all vacation and glory and enjoyment. Sure, there'll be moments of joy because people are coming to Christ, but it's going to be hard work. And so people, I think, need to weigh that in when they're considering whatever they do. And the last thing I want to say, and I want to hear what you think about this,
Hmm.
is if you are looking to be a missionary, but you have done very little or nothing in your local church, why are you becoming a missionary at all?
Right.
Because maybe you can speak on that. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, I can tell you this. When we were on deputation, which was 4 very long years to get my family to Africa when I was a teenager, and for the record, my dad was 40 years old when he went to South Africa as a missionary. So it's never too late. Maybe I'm a little past that myself, I guess. But one of the pastors that we were having a deputation meeting with asked him, what was he doing? What was he doing now? And Dad was teaching the men's Bible study, had taught for 16 years, I think, at the time when he left, or decided to be a missionary. But he said, yeah, we want to know how things are going at home, because if it ain't working at home, we sure as heck don't want to export it.
Mm.
So, yeah, we don't want to export things that
Yeah.
aren't working here.
Yep. 100%. 100%. So, I think a lot of people can mix up missionary work with evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of overlapping,
Mm-hmm.
uh, gray area kind of thing with these two. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what's the difference between being a missionary and being an evangelist.
Okay. Well, here's my take on that. Evangelism is just one tiny sliver. It's one tiny facet of the mission. I think the upbringing that I had, the way that I grew up, the circles that I grew up in, evangelism was everything. That's what it was all about, because we had that Arminian mindset that, if we don't do a good enough job, or if we don't tell the gospel enough, then somebody might go to hell that otherwise wouldn't have, because I messed up the gospel presentation. I didn't say Romans 5:12 at the right time, or Romans 6:3, or, I got the Romans road out of order, and now that poor person is never going to get saved because I messed it up. So I think I come from that high pressure. It's all about evangelism, and we don't really worry too much. Yeah, they should probably go to church after the fact, but the commission that we have is to make disciples. So sharing the gospel, evangelism, that we should preach that to our lost friends. We should preach that to our saved friends. We should preach that to ourselves. That's part of what it means to be a disciple. But as we make disciples, whether it's in a foreign field or in Miami or in West Virginia or wherever we may be, the whole job is making disciples. Evangelism is just one aspect of that. So I think when you talk about do the work of an evangelist, I think there are people that have special gifts, special gifting, special ability. And, some people are very generous and very giving. They have that gift of helps. Some people have a very good administrative abilities. They're gifted in that respect. And some people are gifted in conversation and sharing the gospel with lost people. And I think those people are evangelists. I don't think it's a paid position at the church necessarily. I don't think it's an office in the church. I just think it's a particular gifting that certain people have. And I think this is where it gets a little bit convoluted, because I think just like with youth pastors and taking the responsibility away from fathers, sometimes I think we say, oh, well, that's the evangelist's job, so that's not my job. Rubbish. It's our job. That's what we're called to do. And we should do that day in and day out with each other and with our lost friends.
Yep. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. We have to think of ourselves as, I mean, there are some people that their focus is on evangelism, but we're all called to do it, right? We're all called to evangelize. We're all called to make disciples of all nations. So absolutely, we have to be every single one of us prepared for that.
Yeah. And I don't know where that came from, the Charles Finney or the R.A. Torrey or the Billy Grahams, but at some point we just became obsessed with that. Like forget 98% of the rest of the New Testament. Let's just focus on this one little tiny aspect of it. Not tiny. I don't mean to downplay it. It's very important, but it is just still one facet. And it seems like that became the whole enchilada for a lot of people.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's what happens. Unfortunately, I've seen some people that hear the gospel, right, and they just they don't really know where to go from there, because an evangelist came, preached to them. They're like, okay, cool. I guess I'm saved now. I don't need to do anything else. And it doesn't really work that way.
And listen, like we've talked about before, I mean, God can use that.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't want to discount that again, because God can use that. I mean, my wife's family were involved in the Billy Graham Crusades, and as their follow up to people who'd made professions, they stuck them in Bible studies with all kinds of different denominations. I mean, they ended up with a bunch of, well, I won't even say what denomination they were from, but they didn't know the first thing about the Bible. Zero.
Happens.
I mean, like I was gonna say my kids are all too old, but your 3-year-old, 6-year-old would have more Bible knowledge than a lot of these folks that they got in contact with through the Billy Graham Crusade. So, again, it's not that complicated. It's not about how many programs we can dream up or what plan we can implement. It's about living the truth every day. It's about sharing our faith with each other, with the world. It's about loving our spouse. It's, those things are the things that are simple, but not necessarily easy, because we need to do them every day.
Right. There's a lot of focus on quantity, right? Reaching as many people as we can versus quality, right? And just making sure that, listen, even if I'm speaking to one person, 2 people, 3 people, for the rest of my life as a Christian, and I'm just discipling them, that's worth it, right? Like, unfortunately, a lot of evangeli type churches, right? And I'm not trying to, attack anybody in particular, but at the same time, we have to be aware of these things. It's about volume, right? And let's get more people in the seats, right? And let's make a show out of things. And it's, if you're giving them at best milk,
Hmm.
right? Then you're not really being um, you're not doing what you're called to do, which is to make disciples. You're just kind of entertaining people,
Right.
and maybe giving them a simple little message. And like I said, God can use that, but
Right.
it also does a lot of harm,
Yeah.
right? And so we have to be aware of that. Okay, so you've been a missionary, obviously, as we
Mhm.
already talked about. So for those who are interested in doing missionary work, what would you say are some things that they can expect as a missionary? What are some of the good things? What are some of the not so good things? Maybe you can speak on that.
Well, I mean, you're going to be homesick. I mean, if you're like me, you love your home, even though our home is ultimately not on this planet, even if it is as wonderful as West Virginia is, it's still not our eternal home. But you'd be homesick, and I mean, goodness gracious, there's financial hardships. I mean, depending on where you go, and I mean, I've seen firsthand, demonic activity and some pretty crazy things myself, and that's all part and parcel, but and this is the thing, again, going back to that, we still do the same things. We don't automatically become demon caster outers. We don't automatically we just do the small things. We do them every day, and that's how we combat those things. We still stay on the mission.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of demons briefly, one of the
Hmm.
things I think about is, when Jesus spoke about casting out a demon and how, he'll come back, find the house in order, and then bring back seven more demons, so that the person that that had the demon cast out of them ends up in a worse position than they were at the beginning, right? And
Hmm.
so not that this is the topic of this conversation, but I
Right.
do want to address the whole demonic thing. We're talking about preaching the gospel, and ultimately, whether a person is demon possessed, not demon possessed, whatever, um, what people really need is the gospel. A demon can't live inside a heart where the Holy Spirit lives, right? And so we have to keep that in mind as well. And like you're saying, if that's going to be part of missions work,
Yeah.
we have to understand that the way that you can help those people is not by casting out demons or
Yeah.
any of that stuff. It's by preaching the gospel,
Yeah.
right? And working with
Exactly.
them.
Yeah.
And
I don't know of any passages where we're instructed, commanded, or even encouraged to cast out demons.
right.
So I don't. There are examples of that happening with the apostles and with Jesus Christ, but there's never any exhortation to do that, that I'm aware of, anyway. Uh,
And we're not apostles.
we're
So
not apostles. That's not our role. Let's just do what we've been commanded to do. That's what should make us excited. That's what we should be about, not the the um, the limelight and the luster that comes from the miraculous stuff
mhm,
that we seem to be enamored with.
correct. Yeah. All right. So let me see, how are we doing on time? Okay, I think we got time for a couple more things here. Um, we've been talking about discipleship and sharing the gospel. Obviously, sharing the gospel is essential, right? It's
Hmm.
not just important; it's essential. Um, but why do you think we focus less so on discipleship? And maybe you can give some pointers on, how we can become not just proclaimers of the gospel, but disciple makers.
Again, I'm sorry to sound like a one note Johnny here, but it's doing these things. This is what we're commanded to do. It's about being faithful to our spouses. It's about um, catechizing our children. It's about being faithful in our church, our local church. Um, that's what we're commanded to do. Um, we get that out of focus because we tend to think about the numbers, and we tend to think about making a big splash. And who hasn't heard about this crusade that went to Africa and came back with 48,000 converts, right? I read somewhere somebody was saying that if all of those numbers were true, that it far outseeds the population of the whole continent of Africa. all the different souls that have been saved in different crusades. But I think we tend to get so focused and wrapped up on that we forget to do the things that we're called to do each day, the small and simple things.
Yeah. Yeah. I would add one thing, and it's preach the gospel to your friend, to your family, to your coworker, to whoever, until they start listening or until they get sick of you and tell you, stop talking to me about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that, the gospel is just the beginning, right? Once a person has their heart open to the gospel, then you can start discipling them and showing them what the scriptures say and showing them how to follow Christ and all of that. But I would say, you want to disciple people, especially people who aren't yet believers. Keep preaching the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Look for the opportunities. Don't be disrespectful. Don't, when somebody says, "Hey, listen, I don't want to talk about that anymore," let them
Yeah.
be. But definitely, don't give up on them, because you never know when God's going to open that heart
Yeah.
and hear what you have to say, and ultimately, come to Christ, God willing.
Yeah, our church motto, or our church mission statement is equipping and mobilizing the saints to impact the ends of the earth until the end of time with the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
That's what we're about. And part of that is sharing the gospel with the lost. Part of that is sharing the gospel with the saved. And that's what we do, share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Can I talk for just 1 second about some modern mission stuff before? I know we're getting short on time. I don't know if you got any.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
So again, this is one of those things that when we're talking about teenagers and how we reach the teenagers, we tend to go to this, to the world's concepts for strategy and plan. We got this strategy that we're going to implement. And as I've said several times, doing the simple things is what really matters. But I was involved with a mission agency that was a church planting mission agency, and they would go to different countries and they would establish local churches, and they would pastor them for 5-10 years, however long it took, until they could train up godly leadership and then turn that church over to a local pastor. Just my cousin actually is doing some fantastic work. He is working in Zambia, Uganda, South Sudan, in Syria, and in Alaska. Wow. And but he has kind of almost has a new paradigm where he's actually going into these countries and he's establishing training facilities to train local leadership and installing them as the leadership from the get-go. And I just think that is a fantastic idea. If you're thinking about missions, if you want to go into missions, because again, I could talk a lot about how Africans respond to the white people and, the different cultures. And I'm sure that's true in other countries, whether it be Asia, even Europe or South America. But those cultural differences, it's so difficult to transition sometimes to a native pastor leadership. And I think if you can do that from the get-go, that's a much better paradigm. He is just doing some fantastic work. He is getting into tribes that have been completely closed off to the gospel.
Wow.
Never have allowed access to any kind of missionary or anything like that. He's getting into some of these places. And part of that is because he's getting some of those people to come to him to get training. So that's giving him that doorway to get back in then to establish schools and classes in these areas to train up godly leadership. He's doing a fantastic job doing that. And again, I wanted to say this too. John Piper said this, and I think Vadi said it too, but I've heard it from several different places. I'm not sure which one of them originated it, but you know that there's 3 types of Christians when it comes to missions. There's goers, goers, there's senders, and there's disobedient. So either you can go or you can send, but we don't want you to be disobedient. So be a church that sends missionaries. Be a church that sends you as a missionary. Be part of a church that sends you as a missionary. But either one or the other, be going or be sending. That's really the only options we have there.
Amen. No, absolutely. I didn't understand where you were going with this for a second. You you caught me like a deer in the headlights, but no, absolutely, 100%. Well, okay then. So, is there anything else that you'd like the listeners to know, concerning outreach, missions, reaching younger generation, evangelism, anything? We've talked about a bunch of different things. So, what advice would you give them in terms of reaching out to, wherever they're preaching the gospel at?
Always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you. Jay will tell you, you've probably already figured that out if you're still watching, but it doesn't take very long for me to work West Virginia into a conversation. I mean, it's just part of who I am. It's part of what I love. I love to talk about West Virginia. I'm extremely proud of it. I mean, we have no great national championships to brag about or anything for our sports team, but they're ours. They're mine. And no matter whether they win or lose, I'll always be a West Virginian. But be that way about our faith. I mean, how could anything be more important than Jesus Christ and who he is to us? And if we really love it, and we really, I say it, I don't mean it as far as him. If we love him and if we love his word, then that's going to naturally come out of us. That's going to be something that's very difficult for us to put a lid on. So it should be just a part of who we are, and we should always be prepared to share that with people that we come into contact. And again, like Jay said, I am not an advocate for the browbeating. I'm not honestly not an advocate for open air preaching and street preaching and getting in the face of people and being confrontational. I don't think that there's really I'm not saying there's no place for open air preaching and no place for street preaching. I'm not saying that, but I just think as effective strategies, that's probably the way far down on the list. Just be who you are and love your wife, love your husband, love your children, be faithful at your local church, and speak to people. If those things are true, then that's going to come out. That's just a foregone conclusion to me. And yeah, if it helps you to give yourself some notes or make some kind of a little reminder to help you speak about those things, if that's what it takes, do that. But hopefully, eventually you get to that point where it's just who you are and it just comes out.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. That's great. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining me today. To everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. And until next time, God bless you guys. Take care.
Thank you.